Hello everybody, Fran here at New Testament Explained. This video is part of topic 3.1, which is interpreting the text, and we are going to thoroughly look at biblical criticism. And within this video we're going to cover what do we mean by the term biblical criticism, why is it needed, and finally what are the three main types of biblical criticism. In terms of what biblical criticism is, it becomes quite easy to overcomplicate this because so many different subtopics feed into the term biblical criticism. So I've tried to keep it short and I've tried to keep it concise. So biblical criticism is an umbrella term used for a scholarly approach to studying the Bible, in particular for us, the New Testament. And the reason that we study the New Testament in our case is to try and understand it better. And that might be historically, to understand the history of what was happening in the first century and a little bit beyond, the meaning of the gospel, what the gospel writers are trying to tell us, and the purpose. So again, why are these gospel writers writing their account of the life and work of Jesus? Now, there are what feels like endless ways of studying the Bible and getting access to that understanding. And so biblical criticism is an umbrella term because it encapsulates a lot of different theories. A lot of theories we study and that will be covered in the rest of this topic 3.1 come under the heading of biblical criticism. But on the slide here, is a definition that I would get yourself familiar with in order to be able to define the word quite quickly without kind of going off on all the different theories that make up and come under the heading more broadly of biblical criticism. A crucial question at this point is why? Why do we need biblical criticism? Why do we need to take a scholarly approach to studying the Bible in order to understand it? And the answer is there is an important gap. There is a gap between Jesus dying and resurrecting and the Gospels being written. Unless you are actively thinking about this, what we often forget is that the Gospels were not written in the present tense, if you like. They were not written as Jesus was alive. When Jesus performed a miracle, the gospel writers were not stood there at the scene writing it down. That's not how these gospels came about. Jesus' ministry happened. Jesus died and resurrected. There was a period of time and then the gospels were written. And this gap in between Jesus dying and resurrecting and the gospels being written is absolutely crucial because it is incredibly likely that what happened in those years, in that gap, has an impact on the gospel writers and what they write down. On this slide is a timeline. I'm not going to read it out line by line, but what this timeline tells us is that a lot happened in this gap. It starts with Jesus dying and runs through until 90 CE, which again is about the time we think the gospels are being written. The dates of when they are written is all up for debate. But what we can learn from this timeline is that there is a lot of tension in the aftermath of the death and resurrection of Jesus. There is tension between Christians and Jews. There is tension between Jews and Gentiles within the Christian community. There's tension between Christians and the Roman Empire, which if this comes up as a question, you can link to topic 1.2 really nicely. There are lots of different groups in the aftermath of the death of Jesus who are in a state of tension, and this timeline will kind of narrate different examples of tension. And what that means is when these gospel writers pen their gospel, they are likely to be impacted by all of this. All of this tension is likely to affect what they write down. And that is why we need biblical criticism. When we're studying the Gospels, in our case, we've got to process the fact that a lot was going on when they wrote these down, and that is going to impact our understanding. It's going to impact the meaning of what they write in their Gospels. So please pause this video, make sure you are very familiar with this time frame, because it has so much importance when it comes to looking at the Gospels and what they say in a nutshell. This slide carries on from the last, but it has just a bit more of a focus on the Gospel writers, I suppose, and where they got their information from. So we've acknowledged that there is a gap between the death and resurrection of Jesus and the Gospels being written. We've looked, broadly speaking, at what was going on in terms of the time, and these 4 boxes just give us a bit of a timeline as to how the people who wrote the Gospels were in a position to do so, if you like. So Jesus dies on the cross and resurrects. People after that repeat stories about Jesus. Obviously, this is a huge sort of occurrence in terms of the ministry of Jesus and his death and resurrection. So after that has happened, many people are sharing these stories of things they've seen, things they've heard. At that point, the early Christian community try to preserve these stories. They want to make sure that these stories are not lost and that we don't forget what happened. And therefore, what we get, the final stage, is the authors of the Gospel. So they use these oral stories. Remember, it's generally believed, again, it's quite debatable. In some cases, we don't think that the people who wrote the Gospels witnessed the ministry of Jesus firsthand. We think they weren't there. So the Gospel writers use the stories they have heard through the oral tradition, and they write their Gospels. And again, this is quite important, because if we assume that the people who wrote the Gospels did not witness the ministry of Jesus firsthand, then again, that's going to have a big impact on what they write. It's going to be dependent on what they have heard, and all of these factors are crucial when studying the New Testament. There are 3 types, generally speaking, of biblical criticism, and each are actually going to have their own video in this playlist for topic 3.1, so I'm not going to dwell on them too much here. But just to give you just a very brief overview as to what they are, you've got source criticism, form criticism, and redaction criticism. So source criticism is where you try and work out where the Gospel writers got their information from, essentially. So we're trying to work out where these Gospel writers learnt about Jesus, whether they read a document, whether they used oral tradition. We're trying to pinpoint where the information that they write down came from. And if you imagine a pearl necklace, it's almost like you would be trying to examine where the different pearls come from, like kind of a historical approach, trying to look at the origins of the Gospels, or the pearl if you're taking the analogy. Form criticism is where you examine specific Bible extracts, kind of forms, if you like, and you try to take a Bible passage and you try to put it into context. So you'll try and look at the history of what happened at that time, for example, again, to try and understand it better. And if you take the pearl necklace analogy again, you would be sort of analysing each individual pearl one at a time, separate from each other. And that's similar to form critics who take that approach to studying the Bible or all New Testament passages. They just look at little passages individually, separate to each other. Redaction criticism is the final type, which is where you aim to identify how the author shaped their material overall. So it's looking more at the broader picture of the entire gospel and looking at how the entire gospel was put together. And again, if you've got a pearl necklace analogy, it would be looking at how these pearls are all strung together to make a single necklace. So these 3 types of biblical criticism are quite different to each other, but again, there will shortly, if not already, be videos on each of these in turn in this playlist. At that point, thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, and watch the later videos that look at some of these concepts in a little more detail.